Welcome to True Echo, where every story resonates with the truth that lives in silence, pain, and perseverance. Here we uncover extraordinary journeys of courage, justice, and transformation, stories that not only reflect society's deepest flaws but also echo the powerful resilience of the human spirit. Today's story is a raw, emotional roller coaster about a shy girl, a cruel principal, and a violin that changed everything. Stay with us as we reveal what happened when the humiliation meant to break her became her greatest triumph. Silence hung like a storm cloud inside the grand auditorium of Westridge High. Rows of students sat upright in their stiff plastic chairs, some whispering nervously, others staring straight ahead, not daring to make a sound. Principal Veronica Stevens stood on the stage, her eyes sharp and merciless, scanning the crowd like a hawk surveying prey. Her cream-colored suit was flawless, her blonde hair sculpted into a style that spoke of control, and she had plenty of it. In the very back of the hall stood Jasmine Williams. Barely 15, petite, quiet, and often overlooked, she pressed herself against the wall, arms wrapped around her torso as if trying to disappear. Pain radiated through her back, a sharp reminder of yesterday's wound, one she hadn't told anyone about. She hadn't sat during the entire assembly, and to Principal Stevens, that was enough reason to strike. "Jasmine Williams," Stevens barked, her voice slicing through the still air like a whip. "Heads turned." A wave of murmurs rippled through the student body as Jasmine flinched, caught in the floodlight of the principal's attention. "Why aren't you sitting like everyone else?" Stevens demanded, descending the stage with measured, threatening steps. "Do you think you're special?" I'm sorry, Miss Stevens," Jasmine stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't sit right now. I hurt my back." More whispers. Some students snickered. Jasmine lowered her gaze, cheeks burning with shame. Stevens was already scanning the scene for a new way to humiliate her. Her eyes landed on the violin leaning beside Aisha Robinson, Jasmine's best friend. "Is this yours?" she asked Jasmine, knowing the answer. "No, it's Aisha's," Jasmine replied, trying to remain calm. Without warning, Stevens grabbed the violin and thrust it into Jasmine's trembling hands. "Then you'll play it? At the spring concert. A solo. 3 minutes minimum." Gasp. A few chuckles. Everyone knew Jasmine had never played a single note in her life. "I can't," she whispered. "I've never played before." "Then you'd better learn," Stevens snapped. "Or you'll spend the rest of the semester in detention." And just like that, Jasmine found herself alone, utterly, painfully alone, on that stage, clutching a violin that felt more like a weapon than an instrument. As the students filed out, whispering and laughing behind their hands, Jasmine stood frozen, holding back tears. "This is the worst day of my life," she whispered. But little did she know, this was also the day everything began to change. That afternoon, Jasmine avoided eye contact with everyone as she limped home, each step a stab of pain in her lower back. The memory of Miss Reynolds, the teacher who had forced her onto a broken chair the day before, burned in her mind like acid. That wound, now hidden under her shirt, throbbed with every breath. She hadn't told anyone. Not the school nurse. Not her mother. Not even Aisha. When she got home, she slipped quietly into her room, locking the door behind her. She sat on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and let the tears fall, silent, relentless. Then she stood to change out of her school uniform, and as she opened her closet, an old cardboard box tumbled from the top shelf. Photographs spilled across the floor. One of them caught her eye. Her father. Smiling. Holding a violin. The picture was aged, yellowed with time. Jasmine's heart stopped. On the back was a note in her mother's delicate handwriting. "Michael at his final concert, Eastman School. I wish he hadn't had to give up his passion." She raced downstairs, holding the photo like it might disappear at any moment. "Mom," she called, her voice thick with emotion. "Did Dad play the violin?" Grace Williams looked up from her knitting. Her expression softened as she saw the photograph. "Yes," she said quietly. "Your father was a musical prodigy. He got into Eastman with a full scholarship. But life got hard. When I got pregnant with you, he gave it all up." Jasmine sank into the couch beside her. "Why didn't you ever tell me? I didn't want you to feel like you owed him something. But he always hoped that someday you might pick up where he left off." Jasmine stared at the violin in her hands. It didn't feel so foreign anymore. "Do you think I can do it?" she whispered. Grace placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You're his daughter, Jasmine. If anyone can do it, it's you." That night, Jasmine didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her room, the violin resting in her lap, and stared at it until the sun began to rise. She had 10 days. 10 days to learn something most people spend years perfecting. The odds were impossible. But something had awakened inside her, a fire she had never felt before. And in the soft quiet of morning, as the city outside began to stir, Jasmine whispered into the stillness, "I'll do it. I'll make him proud. I'll make them all regret ever doubting me." The morning after her vow, Jasmine stepped outside with the violin case in hand, the weight of the instrument surprisingly light compared to the pressure on her shoulders. Her back still ached, a deep reminder of Miss Reynolds' cruelty, but something in her had shifted. It was no longer just about survival, it was about transformation. At school, students were already buzzing with rumors. Jasmine could hear fragments of their conversations as she walked down the hallway. "Did you hear? Jasmine's gonna play at the spring concert. She's never even picked up a violin. It's gonna be a disaster." Jasmine kept her eyes forward, her grip tightening on the case. When she opened her locker, a note fluttered out. Someone had scribbled the word failure in red marker, complete with a crude drawing of her holding a broken violin. She didn't react. She simply folded the note, placed it in her backpack and kept moving. At lunch, Aisha rushed over, clutching a sandwich in one hand and her own violin case in the other. "Jas, I brought extra snacks and my practice notebook. I cleared my schedule today. We're starting full training now." Jasmine looked at her with gratitude, blinking back tears she refused to shed in public. "Thank you. I don't know how I'd do this without you." "You won't have to," Aisha said, her voice firm. "We're in this together." The girls found an empty corner behind the gym, far from prying eyes and snickering mouths. Jasmine took a deep breath and placed the violin on her shoulder. It still felt foreign, awkward even, but not hostile. Aisha stood beside her, correcting her posture, showing her how to hold the bow. "Start with the open strings," Aisha instructed. "G, D, A, and E. Just draw the bow slowly. Get a feel for it." Jasmine followed her instructions and a jagged screech sliced through the air. She winced. "Good," Aisha said. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "That didn't sound good." "You made a sound," Aisha replied with a grin. "That's progress." The girls practiced through lunch, then again after school. When they got home, they continued in Jasmine's living room, the notes slowly becoming less screech and more sound. That night, Jasmine's fingers were sore, her arms weak, but her heart throbbed with a new rhythm, determination. By the third day she could play a simple scale. On the fourth, a short, clumsy melody. Then came the first blow. That afternoon, Jasmine approached the music wing, planning to sneak into one of the unused rooms for extra practice before Aisha arrived. But as she turned the corner, she froze. Every single door was locked. A laminated sign was taped to the wall. "All music rooms require special permission from Principal Stevens, effective immediately." Jasmine's stomach dropped. She knocked on the nearest door anyway. Nothing. Down the hallway, she spotted Ms. Reynolds watching from the faculty lounge, sipping coffee. She smiled, mocking, triumphant. Jasmine turned away, her chest tightening. Outside the school, she called Aisha. "They've locked us out. Every room." Aisha didn't even hesitate. "Meet me at the park near my house. Bring the violin." That evening, under the yellow glow of the street lamps, Jasmine stood on the old basketball court, the concrete cracked beneath her shoes. Aisha tuned her violin while Jasmine stretched her sore fingers. "It's not ideal," Aisha said, "but it's enough." And they played. Every night. Rang. Cold. Went. It didn't matter. Jasmine was changing. Each note, each mistake, each correction carving away the timid girl Principal Stevens had tried to break. But the school wasn't done with her. Reynolds assigned 10-page essays only to Jasmine, gave pop quizzes during every class, and tore up her work in front of her peers. Students laughed. Jasmine said nothing. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall. Her mother noticed the bruises under her eyes, the way her back flinched when she sat. But Grace didn't pry. She simply kept the kettle warm and her arms open. "You're strong," she would say each night. "Stronger than anyone knows." Then came the meeting with Mr. Carter. Jasmine had slipped into the disused storage room behind the auditorium one early morning to practice, violin tucked beneath her coat. She didn't expect anyone to hear her. But someone did. "I thought that was you," said a calm voice. She spun around. Mr. Carter, her school's music teacher and a Juilliard alum, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was just." "You were practicing. And doing it well." Jasmine blinked. "Well?" He stepped closer, nodding toward her violin. Your tone is raw. But there's something behind it. Emotion. Purpose. That's something even trained musicians struggle to find. He studied her. I know what Stevens is trying to do. And I know why. Jasmine's heart skipped. You do. Mr. Carter nodded. She's afraid of anyone who refuses to bend. He paused, then smiled. How would you like a coach? That was the moment things changed. Each afternoon, in secret, Mr. Carter met Jasmine in the music store he once trained in as a student. The owner, Mr. Otto, welcomed her warmly. She reminds me of someone I knew, Otto would say. Her father. Jasmine's breath would catch every time. In that old store, Jasmine practiced with a borrowed violin, soft lights overhead, dust dancing in the air like music made visible. Mr. Carter pushed her hard, not with cruelty but with belief. He adjusted her grip, her posture, her breathing. Music, he'd say, isn't what your fingers do. It's what your soul feels. By the 8th day, Jasmine could play Meditation from Thais, not perfectly but with soul. Each note spoke of pain, of triumph, of a girl who refused to break. But the enemy was watching. From her office window, Principal Stevens stared through binoculars at the girl walking home with a violin case tucked under her arm. She's getting better, she muttered. Beside her, Reynolds clenched her jaw. Carter's helping her. We need to stop this. Stevens turned, her smile like poison. Then let's crush her spirit. Tighten the noose. Jasmine walked into school the next morning with dark circles under her eyes and bandages hidden beneath her blouse. Her fingers were raw from hours of practice, but she didn't care. With each sunrise, her determination burned hotter. The violin was no longer just an instrument, it was her armor. But Westridge had become a battlefield. Every hallway was a trap. Students whispered louder now, emboldened by rumors they assumed were true. She's going to crash. She's being forced. She's a fraud. None of them knew the truth, how much pain she'd endured, how much she'd fought. And most importantly, why she refused to give up. Principal Stevens and Miss Reynolds had intensified their assault. Jasmine's locker was vandalized again, this time with slashed sheet music and a note reading, "Go back to where you belong." Reynolds had even announced to the class that Jasmine would now be required to write a daily journal, track her progress, and present it aloud, an effort she claimed to build character. But Jasmine never once lashed out. She swallowed her pain and pushed forward. After school that day, Jasmine found Mr. Carter waiting near the back exit. Without a word, they walked together to Otto's music store. But when they arrived, Mr. Otto met them with something unexpected. A wooden case, old but polished to a gentle sheen. I think it's time, he said. He placed the case on the counter and slowly opened it. Inside lay a violin, deep reddish-brown, with elegant curves and a scroll carved by hand. Jasmine gasped. This belonged to your father, Mr. Otto said, his voice hushed. He gave it to me when he could no longer afford to play. Asked me to keep it safe, in case you ever found your way back to it. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached out, her hands trembling. As she lifted the instrument, a strange warmth flowed through her fingertips, as if the violin itself remembered him, remembered the music, and welcomed her home. I don't know if I'm worthy, she whispered. Mr. Carter stepped forward. It's not about worthiness. It's about purpose. And Jasmine, this violin was meant to be in your hands. That evening she played differently. The sound was richer, more resonant. Every note felt like a message passed down through blood, through time. Do you hear that? Mr. Carter asked, standing near the window. Jasmine paused, uncertain. That's the sound of legacy. The next day, Jasmine practiced in the park again with Aisha, now using her father's violin. The difference was immediate. Aisha's eyes widened after just a few bars. Jess, you're glowing. Jasmine smiled. I finally understand what it's supposed to feel like. That night, while packing up, they heard footsteps on gravel. Aisha froze. Jasmine turned. Out of the shadows emerged a tall figure in a long coat. It was Marcus Williams. Dr. Marcus Williams, director of the Eastman School of Music. Jasmine had only heard his name spoken in reverent tones by Mr. Carter. To see him now, in the flesh, left her breathless. He approached with calm dignity, his eyes kind but discerning. Jasmine Williams? Yes, she said cautiously. I've heard about you, he said, shaking her hand. Carter sent me a recording. Said there was someone I needed to hear. Jasmine's heart pounded. You've come a long way in a short time, Marcus said. And your father was once the most gifted student we ever had. You knew my father? Marcus nodded. Michael and I were classmates. He had a rare gift. But even rarer was the sacrifice he made when he walked away from it all, for his family. I came to see the girl he believed in. Jasmine's throat tightened. I'm not him. No, Marcus replied. But you are his daughter. And your sound, your courage, it's your own. He reached into his coat and handed her a single ticket. I'll be in the audience at the concert. I want to see what you'll do when the world's watching. Then just like that he turned and left, leaving behind silence, awe, and an envelope Jasmine held like gold. The spring concert was now just 2 days away. That night, Jasmine barely slept. On the morning of the concert, Jasmine stood in the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her dress was simple, black with long sleeves, but elegant. Her hair was tied back, revealing the quiet strength in her eyes. She clutched the violin case as she descended the stairs. Grace stood at the bottom, her eyes glistening. You've grown, she whispered. I'm still scared, Jasmine admitted. Grace pulled her into an embrace. That's okay. Fear just means you care. Use it. At school, the auditorium was transformed. Velvet drapes, spotlights, folded programs at every seat. Parents, teachers, and students filled the space, buzzing with anticipation. Backstage, Jasmine sat in the wings, tuning the violin. Her fingers were steady. Her breath deep and slow. Mr. Carter approached and knelt beside her. You ready? I think so, she said. But if I mess up? You won't, he said firmly. But even if you did, they'd remember your courage more than any note you play. Then the MC stepped on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Jasmine Williams. Jasmine froze for one heartbeat, then stood. Her heels clicked against the polished floor. The curtains parted. Hundreds of eyes turned to her. In the front row she spotted Aisha, her mom, Mr. Carter, Marcus Williams. Beside him, Principal Stevens sat with folded arms, her smile tight. Reynolds beside her whispered something under her breath. Jasmine reached center stage, placed the violin on her shoulder, and closed her eyes. The silence in the auditorium was thick, charged with a mix of curiosity, doubt, and veiled anticipation. Hundreds of eyes stared at Jasmine Williams, the girl who had been ridiculed just days earlier, now standing under the brilliant glow of the stage lights. Her dress shimmered subtly, but she didn't feel glamorous. She felt electric, like lightning was building in her chest, waiting to surge through the strings of her father's violin. Her left hand gently pressed down on the fingerboard, her right hand holding the bow steady as it hovered just above the strings. Jasmine took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and whispered to herself, "This is for you, Dad." Then she played. The first note trembled slightly, but it was pure, hauntingly soft like a voice calling from far away. As the melody unfolded, the notes found their place, flowing, expanding, echoing through the vast space like a whispered prayer. She played Meditation by Massenet, a piece filled with emotion, restraint, and soul. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was sincere. Real. Jasmine didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes remained shut. The only world she saw was the one inside the music. Every painful memory, every whispered insult, every bleeding moment beneath the classroom light. She poured all of it into the strings. The bow moved not just with precision but with purpose. Her fingers, once awkward and hesitant, now danced with conviction. The music shifted into its crescendo. People leaned forward in their seats. Even the snickering stopped. In the front row, Stephen's smug expression melted slowly into something more guarded. Reynolds' arms were folded, but her jaw was tight, her fingers twitching. Beside them, Marcus Williams sat upright, unmoving, his eyes closed, listening not as an administrator, but as a musician who understood when something transcended training. And then it happened. The high note near the climax, a notoriously difficult pitch Jasmine had struggled with during every practice, rose from her violin with aching clarity, hanging in the air like suspended hope. A brief gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. She opened her eyes. The entire auditorium was still. She finished the final phrase, letting the last note linger in the air, slowly dissolving into silence. For a beat, no one moved. Then applause. Loud. Then louder. Then a standing ovation. Aisha jumped to her feet, clapping furiously. Grace Williams had tears running freely down her face, hands clasped tightly over her mouth. Mr. Carter smiled with quiet pride. Marcus Williams nodded solemnly. Jasmine stood there, blinking, stunned, not by the applause, but by the realization that she had just done something no one expected. Not even herself. She had turned humiliation into triumph. As the ovation continued, she bowed, deeply, sincerely, and began walking off stage, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline and emotion. But before she could reach the wings, the principal stood. Her heels clicked sharply on the stage as she approached the microphone. "Let's have another round of applause for Jasmine Williams," Stevens said, voice smooth but cold. The audience clapped again, though with less intensity. Jasmine froze at the edge of the curtain. Something felt off. Principal Stevens smiled. "Such courage, such talent," she continued. "It's truly inspiring to see a student overcome her lack of experience to deliver a performance like that." Jasmine's heart sank. There it was, the subtle undermining cloaked in praise. "But of course," Stevens added, her smile growing tighter, "one performance doesn't change everything, does it? In fact, I've always said we must hold all students to high academic and disciplinary standards, no matter how much sympathy they may gather." Gasps rippled through the front rows. Jasmine stood frozen, unsure if she had misheard. "In light of recent behavior," Stevens said, glancing toward Jasmine with false warmth, "and due to disciplinary concerns unrelated to today's performance, it is with regret that I must inform the audience that Jasmine will not be representing Westridge in the County Music Showcase next month." The air went dead. Jasmine blinked, stunned. The County Showcase? She hadn't even known she was being considered. The audience murmured. Mr. Carter stood up. "Excuse me," he called out, stepping into the aisle. Stevens turned, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Carter, is there something you'd like to say?" "Yes," he said firmly. "There's no disciplinary concern. This is retaliation." The crowd buzzed louder. Stevens kept smiling, but her voice dropped an octave. "Please return to your seat, David." "I won't," he said, "because this is bigger than music. It's about abuse of power. Jasmine was targeted, first by Miss Reynolds, then by you. And she still stood here and gave the most moving performance this stage has ever seen." The auditorium erupted in scattered applause and cheers. Stevens' mask cracked, if only for a second. "Enough. This is a school matter, not a popularity contest." Then a deeper voice cut through the noise. "No, it's a matter of integrity." Everyone turned. Marcus Williams had stepped onto the stage. "I'm the director of Eastman," he said calmly, adjusting his blazer. "And I came tonight to scout a student. I have no interest in school politics, but I do know talent when I hear it." Stevens faltered. "Dr. Williams, I don't think." He raised a hand. "You've done quite enough thinking. Ms. Williams," he said, turning to Jasmine. "Would you join me for a moment?" Jasmine nodded, legs trembling, and walked to him. "In my hand," Marcus said, producing an envelope from his coat, "is a full scholarship to Eastman. Tuition, housing, mentorship. All of it. You earned it tonight, not because of sympathy but because you have something rare, soul. And I don't reward soul with suspension." The audience roared. For the first time, Stevens' face lost all composure. Her mouth parted slightly, the color draining from her cheeks. Reynolds sank lower in her seat. "Effective immediately," Marcus said, turning back to the crowd, "we will be welcoming Jasmine Williams into the Eastman family. And to every young musician out there watching this, let her be the reminder that no one gets to define your worth but you." Jasmine stood speechless, clutching the envelope. A tear rolled down her cheek, not from pain but from the kind of joy that comes after surviving a storm. Stevens turned and stormed off the stage. The crowd chanted Jasmine's name. For a moment, she simply stood there, bathed in light, surrounded by a sea of applause, holding the violin that had once belonged to her father. She had won. But she had no idea what was coming next. The cheers were still echoing as Jasmine stepped off stage, her hands trembling as she clutched the scholarship envelope. In the hallway behind the auditorium, her mother rushed to meet her, wrapping her into a fierce embrace. Grace Williams was crying openly now, no longer hiding her pride or her heartbreak. Behind her, Aisha appeared breathless, eyes wide with disbelief and joy. "You did it, Jazz," she whispered, hugging her tightly. "You really did it." Jasmine couldn't speak. She had dreamt of this moment in so many forms, of proving herself, of escaping the shadows of humiliation, but never imagined it would come this quickly, this dramatically. Not only had she earned her place at Eastman, but she had done it under the eyes of the very people who had tried to break her. But as she stood in that hallway surrounded by those who loved her, a sudden chill ran down her spine. Something didn't feel right. From down the corridor, she saw Mr. Carter striding toward them with urgency on his face. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice, pulling Jasmine and Grace aside. "I just got word. The district's education inspector and 2 officers are on their way. They're coming with a file, Witness reports, surveillance footage, everything. Grace stiffened. What kind of reports? Everything Principal Stevens and Miss Reynolds have done, especially what they did to Jasmine. Apparently, someone inside the school finally spoke up. They've been building a case for weeks. It's coming to a head, tonight. Jasmine blinked. You mean, someone finally listened? Mr. Carter nodded grimly. The concert wasn't the end. It was the tipping point. Moments later, a hush fell over the lobby as a tall woman in a black suit walked through the main entrance. Flanked by 2 uniformed officers, her presence was authoritative, measured and commanding. She held a thick folder in her hands, the seal of the State Education Board stamped on the front. The crowd parted for her without a word. The woman's heels clicked sharply against the tile floor as she approached the auditorium doors and signaled for them to open again. The MC, still on stage, looked confused but complied. When the doors opened, the inspector walked directly onto the stage and took the microphone. Good evening. I apologize for interrupting this event, but I come on official business from the State Education Oversight Committee. What we are about to announce may be difficult for many to hear, but it is necessary. And long overdue. A wave of murmurs rolled across the audience. In the last 3 weeks, she continued, our department has received multiple complaints regarding Westridge administration, specifically from students and staff alleging abuse, discrimination, and deliberate sabotage of student success. The room fell into stunned silence. Stevens had returned to her seat by then, pale but composed. Miss Reynolds sat motionless, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. The inspector continued. We now have verified video footage, eyewitness testimony, and written evidence confirming that Principal Veronica Stevens and Teacher Rachel Reynolds have repeatedly abused their positions of authority. Their misconduct includes but is not limited to emotional abuse, racial discrimination, retaliation against students, and coercion. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Grace Williams stood slowly in the back, her face rigid with fury. And most recently, the inspector added, both individuals were involved in intentionally endangering a student's physical and emotional health by forcing her to perform duties beyond her capacity, ignoring medical harm, and orchestrating a public humiliation intended to break her spirit. That student was Jasmine Williams. The audience turned toward Jasmine, who stood just inside the doorway, stunned. She felt Aisha take her hand. You're not alone anymore, her friend whispered. Effective immediately, the inspector declared, Veronica Stevens and Rachel Reynolds are suspended from all educational duties pending a full investigation. Officers, please escort them off the premises. The officers moved swiftly, stepping down the aisle. Stevens stood, trying to maintain her composure. This is absurd, she snapped. This is a performance. These are false accusations meant to smear. We have the video of you handing Jasmine the violin and telling her to learn quickly or face detention, the inspector said coolly. We also have footage of Ms. Reynolds forcing her into a broken chair, resulting in a physical injury. The security camera caught the entire incident. Reynolds muttered something inaudible and began to cry as the officers approached. Stevens glared at Jasmine across the room. You planned this, she spat, her voice low and venomous. You little? Enough, the inspector snapped. You've done enough damage. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the once feared Stevens and Reynolds were led down the aisle, past students, parents, and staff who now looked at them with horror, disappointment, and relief. When they reached the exit, Stevens turned one last time. Her eyes met Jasmine's, and for the first time they didn't burn with contempt. They looked afraid. Then she was gone. The doors slammed behind them, the echo reverberating like the closing of a chapter. Back inside, the inspector turned back to the audience. Let this be a message, she said. That no school, no matter how prestigious, is above accountability. And no student, especially those who are brave enough to speak up, should ever feel small in the place meant to help them grow. Thunderous applause erupted once more. Jasmine stood still, the weight of everything finally settling in her chest. She had fought. She had bled. And now she had won, not just for herself but for every student who had been too scared to speak. As she turned to leave, Marcus Williams stepped beside her. You're not just going to Eastman, Jasmine, he said softly. You're going as a symbol of what courage and truth can accomplish. She looked up at him, her throat tight. But I'm just a girl with a violin. He smiled. No. You're the girl who turned a weapon of humiliation into a voice that couldn't be silenced. They walked out of the auditorium together, the hallway quiet now, the lights dimming. Outside, Grace and Aisha were waiting. You ready? Her mother asked. Jasmine nodded, gripping her violin case like it held the universe. "Let's go home." The night air was cool and crisp as Jasmine stepped out of Westridge's front doors. Behind her, the once proud institution seemed smaller somehow, as if the shadows that had long clung to its walls were finally being pulled back by the light of truth. She walked quietly beside her mother and Aisha, her fingers still clutching the worn handle of her father's violin case. For the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was calming. Peaceful. Grace slipped her arm around Jasmine's shoulders. "You okay?" Jasmine nodded slowly. "I think I am, for the first time in a long time." "You were incredible," Aisha added, her voice still buzzing with excitement. "They'll be talking about tonight for years." But Jasmine didn't feel like a hero. Not yet. Her hands still shook. Her legs still ached from the hours of standing, practicing, waiting. And her heart carried the weight of everything that had led her here. That night she couldn't sleep. Even wrapped in her warm blanket, even with the sound of the rain tapping gently at the window, her mind raced. Images flickered like flashes of lightning behind her eyes. Miss Reynolds' cruel smile, the sharp jab of the broken chair, Stephen's venomous voice echoing in the auditorium. But also, her mother's pride, Aisha's unwavering loyalty, Mr. Carter's encouragement, and the applause, the deafening, beautiful applause that still rang in her ears. She got up and walked to her closet. Kneeling, she pulled out the photograph of her father, the one with him smiling, violin in hand, eyes bright with the fire of music. She touched the frame gently. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "But I'm not finished yet." The following week, Jasmine's story became a sensation. It started with a single article in the local paper titled, "Student's Violin Solo Unmasks School Abuse Scandal." Then a news station picked it up. Then two. Then a national morning show invited her for an interview. Jasmine sat on a soft studio couch in a modest blue dress, her violin resting beside her as the host leaned forward with interest. "What gave you the strength," the host asked, "to walk onto that stage knowing they wanted you to fail?" Jasmine hesitated, glancing briefly at the audience in the studio before answering. "I remembered who I was," she said softly. "I remembered who my father was, and that I didn't have to prove I was worthy, I just had to remember that I always was." The video went viral. Hundreds of thousands of views. Then millions. Comments poured in, people from around the country and even overseas, inspired by her resilience. "You made me believe I can fight my bullies too. Your story helped me speak up at work. Thank you. I'm crying and I don't even play violin." Jasmine tried not to let it overwhelm her, but deep down she felt something had changed, not just in her life but in how the world saw her. She was no longer just that girl from Westridge. She was Jasmine Williams, the girl who played through the pain, who stood tall in the face of injustice, who turned a cruel joke into a standing ovation. And Eastman took notice. When she stepped onto the campus of the Eastman School of Music 2 weeks later, the grand arched buildings and stained glass windows felt surreal. Jasmine wore her father's old scarf, a faded deep green wool that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Dr. Marcus Williams met her at the gate. "I used to walk these paths with your father," he said, hands clasped behind his back. He would always hum a tune even when no one was listening. He said music lived inside him even in silence. Jasmine smiled softly. "That sounds like him." "You remind me of him," Marcus said. "But you've got something else too. Something he never had." She tilted her head. "What's that?" "A fire born from injustice. He played for beauty. But you play for truth." That afternoon she was introduced to her new mentor, a violinist named Anya Kozlova, a renowned soloist known for her intensity and passion. At their first lesson, Anya listened silently as Jasmine played, then stood up without a word, walked to her bookshelf and pulled out an old composition. "I want you to prepare this for our spring showcase," Anya said, handing it over. "It's a piece rarely played by students, too emotional, too raw. But I think you understand it." Jasmine opened the sheet music and read the title, Elegy for the Silenced. The notes were jagged, sweeping, full of haunting tension and sudden swells of beauty. She felt her breath catch. "It's the hardest piece I've ever given a student," Anya said. "But I've seen what you can survive. Now let's see what you can express." That night, Jasmine practiced in a small corner of the Eastman practice hall, her father's violin resting on her shoulder like an old friend. The room was dimly lit, but her music filled the space with something more powerful than light, honesty. Each note was a scar reopened, then healed. Each phrase a story she had once been too afraid to tell. And outside the window, as the snow began to fall gently onto the Eastman lawn, The world kept listening. But back at Westridge the dust had not yet settled. The school, reeling from scandal, appointed a new interim principal, Dr. Eleanor Gaines, a veteran educator known for her fierce advocacy for marginalized students and her firm but fair leadership style. On her first day she called for a full assembly. Jasmine, watching from her dorm room at Eastman via livestream, sat stunned as Dr. Gaines stepped onto the stage and declared, "Westridge will no longer be a school that tolerates silence over justice. We will build something better brick by brick." She then introduced a new initiative, the Jasmine Williams Scholarship for Emerging Artists, a yearly award granted to one student who demonstrated not just talent, but resilience, compassion, and courage. Jasmine's mouth fell open. Her phone lit up with a message from Aisha, "You're a legend." And maybe, Jasmine thought for the first time, she believed it. But even legends have more to prove. That weekend, Jasmine received a letter, not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten note in a pale envelope. There was no return address. She opened it cautiously. The note inside read, "You may have won the audience, but the world has many stages. Be ready." No signature. No name. Her heart pounded. Was it a threat? A warning? Or something else entirely? She turned it over, but the back was blank. Frowning, she tucked it into her violin case, next to her father's photograph. Whatever it meant, one thing was clear: her journey wasn't over. Not even close. The mysterious letter haunted Jasmine for days. She'd stare at the envelope at night, its plainness more unsettling than if it had been filled with rage. It was too calm. Too deliberate. Whoever wrote it didn't want to be seen, but wanted to be heard. You may have won the audience, but the world has many stages. Be ready. It sounded like a warning. But for what? She tried not to let it distract her, throwing herself deeper into practice. Elegy for the Silenced was unlike any piece she'd ever played. It wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be honest. And sometimes, honesty hurt. The first time she played the middle section she had to stop and set the violin down, her hands shaking, throat tight. She couldn't explain why it affected her so much. The dissonant harmonies, the harsh bow strokes, it was like the music remembered her pain, and was forcing her to relive it. Anya noticed. After one particularly difficult session, she sat across from Jasmine and simply asked, "What are you afraid of?" Jasmine hesitated. "That I'm still carrying all of it. That no matter how far I go, the pain follows me. Like it's stitched into the music now." Anya nodded slowly. "Pain is a part of you. But so is survival. So is strength. Don't play the notes to relive the pain, play them to reclaim it." That night, Jasmine stayed late in the practice room. She didn't try to be perfect. She didn't try to impress. She just played. Played until her fingers went numb, until the raw emotion poured from the violin like rain against a window pane. When she finished, a quiet applause came from behind the door. She turned, startled. It was Marcus Williams. "I heard you were working late," he said, stepping into the room. "That piece, it's not just a performance. It's a reckoning." Jasmine exhaled. "It feels like it's pulling everything out of me." "It's supposed to," Marcus said. "Because it's not only your story anymore. It's every voice that was silenced before you." He handed her a folded program. "You'll be performing it at the Winter Honors Showcase. The final act. Spotlight solo." Jasmine's eyes widened. "Me? But you've already earned it. The world's watching, Jasmine. This is your moment." Back at Westridge, change was moving faster than anyone expected. Dr. Gaines initiated a complete overhaul of the faculty evaluation system. Every student now had a voice in classroom reviews. Clubs were created for student activism, diversity inclusion, and restorative justice. Teachers who had remained silent during Stevens and Reynolds' reign were asked to publicly attend accountability workshops and offer formal apologies. Mr. Carter, now the Director of Arts, designed a new program, Music and Justice, an initiative that provided instruments, training, and mentorship to underprivileged students across the district. And he didn't name the pilot classroom after himself. He named it after Jasmine Williams. The night of the showcase arrived like thunderclouds over calm water, sudden and heavy with weight. Eastman Hall was packed. Critics, professors, alumni, even celebrities with ties to the music world had taken their seats. The program had featured impressive talent already, duets, quartets, and soloists who had trained since childhood. But Jasmine was the finale. Backstage, she tuned her violin in silence. The scarf her father had once worn rested around her neck. Her mother was seated in the third row. Aisha had traveled in from Westridge to see the performance, and she sat beside Grace, whispering excitedly. Jasmine's heart pounded. She didn't fear failure. She feared not feeling. Marcus approached and knelt beside her. "You ready?" "I don't know," she admitted. "This feels like more than music now." "It is," he replied. "But remember, you're not just playing for applause. You're playing for all the people who never got to speak." The stage lights dimmed. A voice echoed through the auditorium. "Now, performing Elegy for the Silenced, we welcome Jasmine Williams." She stepped into the light. There was no sound but the soft creak of the wood beneath her shoes. She took her position, raised the violin, and drew the first note. It was not gentle. It was not sweet. It was real. A low, grinding dissonance filled the room, a sound of unrest, of pain, of injustice. Then came the tremolo, a nervous energy, a quiver of fear barely contained. Jasmine's bow hand shook slightly, but she leaned into it, allowed it, when it. The second movement came like a storm, violence, memory, rage. The bow slashed across the strings. The notes cracked and soared. People in the audience leaned forward, hands over their mouths. And then, the silence. A single pause. A breath. Jasmine closed her eyes. And from that stillness she played the most fragile, trembling melody of the piece, the moment of truth. Her soul unfolded, layer by layer. Her story was there. The broken chair, the detention threat, the nights in the park, the letter with no name. It was all there. And when she reached the final chord, she let the bow hang for a beat longer, just long enough to feel the room inhale and forget to exhale. She lowered the violin. And the world was quiet. Then came the standing ovation. Not a polite rise, not a cue from others, but a spontaneous eruption of movement and applause, people leaping to their feet, hands clapping, shouts of "bravo," ringing from the balcony to the orchestra level. In the crowd, Grace wept openly. Aisha screamed. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, smiling with deep pride. Anya in the wings nodded once. And Jasmine? She bowed. Then she turned and walked off stage, not as the girl they tried to break, but as the artist no one could ever silence again. But just as she reached the wings, someone approached her quietly. A woman in a tailored black suit. The same woman from the auditorium at Westridge, the state education inspector. "You played beautifully," she said softly. "I came to watch. But I also came with news." Jasmine's breath caught. "What kind of news?" The inspector handed her a folder. "There's been another report. A new development in the case against Stevens and Reynolds." Jasmine's fingers tightened on the folder. The inspector leaned in. "This time, it involves more than just Westridge. Much more." Jasmine stared at the manila folder in her hands, the weight of it heavier than any she'd ever held. The inspector didn't speak again. She simply gave a small nod and disappeared into the shadows of the backstage hallway, leaving Jasmine alone in the dim corridor, her violin still humming with echoes of the performance. For a moment, Jasmine just stood there, frozen. Then, slowly she opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents, official reports, and scanned letters. Some familiar, many not. Names she'd never heard. Schools she didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. Westridge had not been an isolated incident. At least 5 other schools, each overseen by the same district board Stevens had ties to, were named. Similar patterns. Similar reports. Suspensions for discipline violations, disproportionately targeting black and brown students. Complaints from students mysteriously lost or dismissed. Whistleblower teachers silenced or fired. All roads, all abuse of power traced back to a circle of administrators, with Stevens in the center. And Jasmine? She had become the crack in the dam. The inspector had left a note inside, handwritten on the last page. "This is bigger than we thought. But now that you've pulled back the curtain, we think you might be able to help finish what you started." Jasmine closed the folder, her pulse quickening. What had started as a cruel joke, a violin performance meant to humiliate her, was unraveling into something much deeper, much darker, but also much more meaningful. She walked quietly back to the dressing room where Grace and Aisha waited. The moment they saw her face, both stood up. "What happened?" her mother asked. Jasmine held out the folder. "They found more. Other schools. Other students." Aisha grabbed the nearest chair, stunned. "It's not just Westridge?" Jasmine shook her head slowly. "No. Stevens wasn't just a principal. She was part of a network, and now we have the proof." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the gentle hum of the hallway lights. Then Grace stepped forward and gently placed her hand over Jasmine's. "What do you want to do?" she asked, voice soft but steady. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Speak. 2 weeks later, Jasmine stood behind a podium on the steps of the State Board of Education, surrounded by press cameras and reporters. Aisha stood beside her. Mr. Carter and Dr. Marcus Williams flanked her on either side. Behind her stood Grace, quiet but proud. Jasmine wasn't reading a speech. She didn't need to. She spoke from her heart. "I was just a student," she began. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I didn't want to fight. I wanted to belong, to learn, to be safe." She paused, her voice steady despite the wind swirling around her scarf. "But when the very people who are supposed to protect and educate you become your abusers, when your pain is mocked, when your voice is silenced, what choice do you have but to speak louder?" The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "I played a violin solo to survive," she continued. "And somehow that sound traveled far enough for others to finally listen. But this isn't just about music or about me. This is about every student who was told they weren't good enough. Every child punished for raising their hand. Every voice buried under paperwork and protocol." She lifted the folder and placed it on the podium. "These are not isolated cases. They're patterns. And we're here to end them." The press exploded with questions. Camera flashes erupted like fireworks. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She had become the melody the system couldn't ignore. The investigations that followed were sweeping. State officials uncovered systemic racism buried beneath decades of carefully worded policies and rigged performance evaluations. Administrators who had been protected for years suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Several quietly resigned. Others were forced out publicly. Stevens and Reynolds, now facing mounting charges, were arraigned in court. The footage of Jasmine being forced to sit on the broken chair played before a jury. Reynolds had nothing to say. Stevens attempted to blame misinterpretation of discipline protocols. The judge wasn't convinced. Both were found guilty of gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and discrimination. Jasmine and Grace were in the courtroom when the sentence was read. As the judge's gavel fell, mother and daughter held each other in a quiet, tearful embrace. Justice for the first time had a sound, and it echoed in every heart that watched. Back at Eastman, life moved forward, but never the same. Jasmine became more than just a student. She was invited to speak at youth leadership summits, social justice forums, and international music conferences. Her face appeared on magazine covers. "The girl who played through pain," one headline read. But she never let it consume her. She still practiced every night. Still polished her father's violin every Sunday. Still walked the halls with humility and grace. Marcus once told her, "Some people change the world with ideas. Some with power. You did it with a bow and 4 strings." She smiled when he said that, but she never fully believed it. Until one afternoon in a small Eastman classroom, a timid first-year student approached her after a practice. "Oh, Miss Williams?" the girl said nervously. Jasmine turned. "Just Jasmine. I just wanted to say your story helped me apply. I was scared. But then I saw you. And now I know I belong here." Jasmine's throat tightened. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You do belong here," she said. "You always did." One snowy morning, Jasmine received an envelope in the mail, one without a name or return address. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't seen one like it since that strange letter before the winter showcase. She opened it. Inside was a small handwritten note. "There are still more stages. More voices to find. More truths to set free. Stay brave. A friend. Asterisk. No threats. No fear. Just a reminder." Jasmine folded the note and tucked it into her violin case beside her father's photo and the first letter she ever received. Then she closed the case, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the practice hall. Because she knew. The next movement was just beginning. Spring arrived in Rochester with a hush of warmth and wind. The cherry trees lining Eastman's campus burst into bloom, their soft petals dancing in the breeze like gentle reminders that healing was possible, even after a brutal winter. Jasmine walked those streets with calm certainty now. No longer the anxious girl clutching her father's violin case like a shield. No longer playing to prove she belonged. She knew she belonged. But she hadn't slowed down. Each week, Jasmine met with a small group of first-year students for evening practice sessions. Some were from disadvantaged backgrounds. Some carried trauma they hadn't yet named. And yet they all shared one thing: raw, untamed hope. Jasmine didn't teach them to be perfect. She taught them to be honest. And when they stumbled, she reminded them, "You don't have to sound good to be heard. You just have to mean it." Meanwhile, the Music and Justice Initiative expanded rapidly, with Eastman now formally collaborating with districts across the state. Jasmine's name appeared on scholarship applications and youth mentoring posters. She was nominated for a national award in education advocacy. She even received a letter, handwritten, from the Secretary of Education, thanking her for being the bridge between silence and sound. Still, through all the recognition, all the interviews, Jasmine remained grounded. Because she never forgot where it started. And one day that past came walking through the front gates of Eastman. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Jasmine received a message from the front office. A visitor had arrived for her, someone from Westridge. When she reached the lobby, she froze. It was Mr. Otto, the elderly owner of the music store where she had first practiced, where she had first touched her father's violin with trembling fingers. He was thinner now and slower on his feet, but his eyes gleamed the same as ever. "Mr. Otto," Jasmine breathed, rushing over to hug him. "I had to see it for myself," he chuckled. "The little girl with the trembling hands who played in my dusty backroom, now lighting up Eastman." She smiled, touched beyond words. "You were the first place I felt safe. Thank you for that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a velvet pouch. "This was your father's tuning fork," he said gently. "He used it to test pitch every morning, said it kept his heart in tune. I think he'd want you to have it now." Jasmine took it with both hands, eyes stinging with tears. The fork was simple, silver, but it vibrated in her palm with invisible energy, as if some part of him still lived in the hum. "I'll keep it with me always," she whispered. Otto smiled, then added, "He'd be proud of you, you know. Not just for how you played, but for how you stood." The National Education Conference arrived just weeks later. Held in Washington, D.C., thousands of students, teachers, activists, and leaders gathered for the multi-day event, with Jasmine slated as the closing keynote speaker. She had been writing her speech in pieces, on napkins, in journals, on the back of practice sheets. But nothing ever felt quite right. Until the night before the speech, when she sat on the rooftop of her Eastman dorm, wind in her curls, stars overhead. She didn't write the speech. She played it. With her father's violin in hand, she poured every word she couldn't speak into music. When she finished, she finally understood what she needed to say. The next morning, as she stood behind the sleek podium, the entire conference hall fell quiet. She wore a simple black dress, the tuning fork in her pocket, the violin waiting nearby on a stand. Her eyes scanned the room. "My name is Jasmine Williams," she began. "And I didn't set out to change anything. I just wanted to survive." She paused, letting the weight of the sentence settle. "But sometimes, survival is resistance. And sometimes resistance sounds like a bowed string." She spoke of Westridge, of injustice, of humiliation and silence. She told them how music became her sword, her sanctuary, and her truth. Then she stepped away from the microphone and lifted her violin. What followed wasn't the elegy, or a familiar piece from a composer's book. It was her own. She played the first composition she had ever written, titled, "For Those Who Were Never Heard." The notes rose like a quiet rebellion, trembling with sorrow, then climbing into strength. The audience didn't just hear it, they felt it. And when she played the last note, letting it ring like a question left unanswered, the silence that followed was reverent. Then came the standing ovation. Again. And this time Jasmine didn't cry. She smiled. Because she knew this wasn't the end. That summer, Jasmine returned to Westridge, not as a student, not as a victim, but as a guest of honor. The school had changed. The walls had been repainted. The music room was twice the size. The staff now included counselors who specialized in student trauma and inclusion. And the auditorium, once the scene of Jasmine's public humiliation, was now dedicated to student-led performances, named the Williams Performance Hall. Principal Gaines met Jasmine at the entrance, arms open. "You didn't just change Westridge," she said, "you awakened it." Jasmine toured the campus with Aisha, who had now joined the school's student mentorship program. Everywhere they went, younger students lit up at the sight of her, some even asking for autographs. "I never thought I'd be a role model," Jasmine told her. "You didn't try to be," Aisha replied. "That's what makes you one." Before leaving, Jasmine stood for a moment at the base of a newly erected sculpture in the courtyard. A bronze figure of a girl holding a violin to the sky, eyes closed, face calm. On the base an inscription read, "She turned silence into sound and sound into justice." And beneath that, Jasmine Williams. Jasmine ran her fingers over the engraving. She didn't feel proud. She felt ready. Because somewhere out there another voice was waiting. Another story silenced. And Jasmine? She was no longer just a violinist. She was the echo. The final chapter of Jasmine Williams' journey didn't begin on a stage, under spotlights, or with applause. It began on a quiet morning in a small classroom in Atlanta, where 15 children sat cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide, their hands clumsy on mismatched instruments. Jasmine stood at the front of the room, her father's violin resting gently in her left hand, a chalkboard behind her filled with simple music notation. She smiled softly as one student, barely 10, his violin squeaking with effort, played a wrong note for the 5th time and scrunched his face in frustration. "It's okay," she said, kneeling beside him. "You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be heard." The boy blinked at her, surprised. "I thought music was supposed to be pretty." "No," she replied gently. "It's supposed to be true." And that was the essence of Jasmine's new chapter. After her return from the national conference, she had quietly begun building something new, an initiative called Project Echo, a community-based music program that partnered with underserved schools across the U.S. to offer free music education, emotional resilience training, and storytelling workshops for students who had experienced trauma or discrimination. Funded in part by Eastman and in part by the countless donations from supporters around the world who had watched her story unfold, Project Echo was more than a classroom. It was a revolution, in harmony. Instead of competition, it fostered healing. Instead of recitals, it created testimonies. Each child was encouraged to tell their story not just through words, but through music. In one classroom, a refugee girl from Syria composed a song called "No More Running." In another, a boy who had once been suspended for fighting performed a quiet, aching solo called "I Was Angry Because No One Listened." Jasmine didn't try to fix them. She just gave them space. And that, she believed, was the start of real healing. 1 year later, Jasmine stood once again on the stage of Eastman Hall. Not as a student but as an honored alumna. She had returned for a special occasion, the unveiling of the Michael and Jasmine Williams Fellowship, a new full-ride scholarship dedicated to first-generation musicians with a passion for justice and expression. As she stepped up to the podium, she looked out over the crowd, familiar faces among the new. Grace Williams, front row, tears in her eyes. Aisha, now a published author of young adult novels, smiling brightly. Mr. Carter, hair grayer but eyes just as warm. And seated beside them, students from Project Echo, dressed in mismatched jackets and too big ties, grinning and whispering among themselves. "I've played many stages," Jasmine began, her voice steady. "But this one will always feel like coming home." She paused, letting the room settle. "This fellowship isn't just in my name. It carries my father's name too. A man who gave up his dream so I could have mine. A man who believed that music wasn't just about performance, it was about truth." She lifted her violin. "This is the first piece I ever wrote. It's called Home in the Sound. And I want to play it for all the voices, young and old, who are still learning that their pain has power, that their stories matter, and that silence does not mean absence." The music rose like a memory. It wove through grief and grace, through rage and redemption. There were no lyrics, but everyone in that hall could hear the story. And when the final note faded, no one clapped immediately. They just sat there stunned. Some wiped tears. Some bowed their heads. Then, like rain after a long drought, the applause came. And Jasmine didn't bow this time. She just smiled. Because she wasn't performing anymore. She was passing it on. Years passed. Project Echo grew into a national movement. Jasmine was invited to speak before the United Nations on the role of music in healing trauma. She received honorary doctorates. She was named one of Time magazine's Women of the Year. Her face appeared on murals in cities she'd never been to. But she never stopped returning to the music rooms. Never stopped sitting cross-legged with kids. Never stopped holding their hands when they trembled. Because fame wasn't the goal. Connection was. And legacy. One winter evening, Jasmine walked through the old neighborhood where she and her mother had once lived. The streets were quieter now, the corners familiar. She passed Westridge, now a shining symbol of reform, and smiled at the courtyard statue, the girl with the violin held high. A bus pulled up. A group of students stepped off, laughing. One recognized her. "Hey, aren't you the violin girl?" he called out. Jasmine smiled. "That's me. My sister's in your program," he said. "She wrote a song about our mom." Jasmine placed a hand over her heart. "She's braver than she knows." The boy grinned and ran to catch up with his friends. And Jasmine turned, slowly making her way back toward the little house on Maple Lane, her old home. Grace had kept it, turning it into a neighborhood hub for young girls. It now hosted evening meals, music lessons, and storytelling nights. Jasmine slipped inside and found her mother seated at the old dining table, reading letters from the latest Project Echo graduates. "They still write?" Jasmine asked softly. "Every week," Grace said, smiling. "You gave them more than lessons, Jas. You gave them language." Jasmine sat beside her, picking up a letter. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. "I didn't know my sadness had a sound. Now I play it. And I'm not afraid of it anymore." Jasmine closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long time she felt her father there, not just in the violin or the photo frames or the echoes of his sacrifice, but in her. Because she had become everything he hoped to be. Not just a musician. Not just a survivor. But a lighthouse for others still lost at sea. And so, Jasmine Williams' story, once built on silence and shame, became a symphony of hope, truth, and transformation. From the trembling hands of a girl forced to play as a punishment, to the confident hands of a woman guiding thousands to speak through music. She was once the subject of a cruel joke. But now, she was the voice that wouldn't fade. She was the echo that would never be silenced. She was the bow drawn across every injustice, transforming pain into purpose and noise into meaning. And somewhere in a dusty music store, an old violin still hummed with every note she ever played, and all the notes still waiting to come. In a world where silence is often mistaken for weakness, Jasmine Williams proved that one voice, one trembling string, can shift an entire system. Her journey reminds us that the most powerful echoes don't come from volume. They come from truth. So we ask you now, what story are you silencing? What song inside you deserves to be heard? Because maybe you're the echo someone else is waiting for. Thank you for watching True Echo. If Jasmine's story moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below, how has a single moment changed your life? And don't forget to subscribe for more real, raw, and powerful stories that prove one voice can change the world. We'll see you in the next story.